Grandfather's Christmas Tree. When I was a child, my family spent most of our holidays on my grandparents' ranch in northern Colorado. To a small boy from the city, it was heaven. Of everything I remember, two things are the most clear in my mind. First is the single tall blue spruce tree standing in front of my grandparents' home. The other is a small wooden nest cradling two carved geese and their fine, tiny goslings. Every year on Christmas Eve, I watched as my grandfather placed the little nest in the low branches of the blue spruce. One Christmas morning when I was 8 years old, I asked him why this was so. This is the story he told me. My mother and father came to Colorado in May of 1886. They had left their home in Illinois early that month, traveling westward on the railroad through Iowa and Nebraska and finally into Colorado. Like so many others at that time, my parents longed to leave the crowded cities east of the Mississippi for the open country of the western frontier. In Denver, my parents bought horses, a wagon, and the supplies they would need to continue their journey. In mid-June, they found this gentle valley where low foothills pushed up against the towering Rocky Mountains. There was plenty of grass for grazing animals, and trees good for firewood covered the hillsides. A clear running stream drained the lowlands near a small stand of blue spruce that would shelter a home from wind in the winter and the hot sun in July. They settled this piece of land and set to work making a new life together. My father toiled all summer and into the fall, clearing land and building their first home. My mother cared for the animals, tended to the garden, and did whatever else needed doing. One morning, my mother told my father she had some wonderful news. At Christmas time, a baby will come, she told him. They felt grateful and very happy, but also just a little lonely. My parents realized for the first time just how much they were truly on their own. The nearest town was a half a day's wagon ride, and their closest neighbor lived 4 miles away. By the third week of October, frost covered the land most mornings like a cold blanket. Every few days, great flocks of geese flying south from Canada would swoop low over the ranch, searching for food and a place to rest. Winter would soon arrive, and my parents had done their best to be ready. The house was complete enough to provide shelter, and my mother had been busy putting up vegetables and stocking the pantry. My father had hauled several cords of firewood down from the hills and had stacked the logs neatly outside the door. But nothing could have prepared them for what was to come. November and December of 1886 brought blizzards to these parts that sometimes howled for days on end. Snow piled into drifts 6 feet high, burying wagon trails, fences, and cattle. A rancher could go out for firewood or to check on his animals and become lost just 50 feet from his door. Even when the snow would let up for a while, the cold and wind continued. Though they loved each other deeply, my mother and father felt very, very alone. 3 weeks before Christmas, most of the logs my father had chopped and split had been burned in the wood stove. By then, snow was higher than a horse's belly. There was no hope of leaving the ranch or of hauling more wood from the hills any time soon. At that moment, my parents realized they would have to start cutting down the blue spruce trees that sheltered the house if they hoped to survive the winter. Only the spruce could provide the firewood they so desperately needed. Several days later, after my father had been chopping at one of the remaining trees for most of the morning, my mother went outside to call him in for lunch. While standing by the door, she noted 2 geese huddled in the snow under the low boughs of the tallest blue spruce. This seemed peculiar to my mother, who remembered sadly how all of the geese had flown south soon after the first blizzard struck. She sorely missed the sight of the perfect chevrons they formed high in the sky. As she slowly inched her way closer, she noticed that one of the great birds was injured. Its left wing bent at an odd angle. Broken somehow, my mother gently called to my father to join her. Not being familiar with the ways of wild geese, my father startled the pair. The healthy bird hissed and pecked and flapped its wings. My mother told my father how she had heard that geese, like people, pair for life. The big goose was protecting its injured mate, just as my folks would watch out for each other. My father agreed to leave the geese in peace and let nature take its course. Late that night, I was born. Howling wind shook the walls and sleet splattered against the windows. To warm me, my mother held me to herself as my father covered us with a large, soft quilt. The light of the fire burning in the wood stove pierced the darkness. My father looked at the handsome woman lovingly cradling her babe. His calm, deep voice cut through the roar of the squall. "Now we are a family," he said with pride. See, there's the baby. Now we are a family. The weather did not change much over the next 2 weeks. Every few days the storm came screaming out of the frozen sky, dropping great sheets of snow and ice and chilling even the bravest hearts among the strong people who settled the land. Huge drifts of heavy snow nearly buried our door, and layers of frosty mist coated the window panes. Christmas Eve arrived bitter cold, with high, broken clouds. My father looked at our meager supply of logs and guessed we would burn them all within the next several weeks. He knew the time had come to cut down the towering spruce tree. As my father was getting ready, my mother begged him not to take down the great tree just yet, knowing that if it was gone, the 2 geese sheltering under it would surely die. He said that without more firewood, we would not live to see the spring. We've endured much this winter," my mother said in a strong, low voice. "You must believe that all will be well." The strength of her voice was soothing. Finally, my father agreed to leave the tree standing until Christmas Day had passed. That night, the moon cast its icy white light over the frozen valley. The wind rushed down from the mountains, rattling the windows as if in anger, and blowing snow right through the tiniest gaps in the doorframe. A new storm was coming to life. My mother sang a lullaby as she gently rocked me to sleep. Her thoughts drifted to the geese. Since the day she had found them, my folks had helped keep them alive by piling handfuls of grain and leaving bowls of water under the spruce tree. These brave animals seemed almost part of our family. There had to be some way to save them. As the night wore on, the storm battered our home in all its fury. With a loud snap, the wind tore a giant branch from the spruce and sent it hurtling into the side of our house. The noise was fearsome, but the cabin was strong. Finally, my parents drifted to sleep, huddled together, hoping and praying for a miracle. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, with golden sunshine streaming through the windows and washing over the walls. My parents awoke to the sound of dripping water. They picked me up, pulled on their boots, and ran outside, my mother holding me, still asleep, in her arms. Big slabs of slushy ice were breaking apart and sliding with a crash off the roof. The warm air was so still, not a whisper of wind could be heard. Brilliant sunlight blazed upon the snow. Wrapping us tightly in his big embrace, my father said, "I know now that you are right, my dearest. All will be well under heaven." All that following week, the sun bathed the valley in its mellow heat. By New Year's Day, much of the snow had melted, and my father was finally able to take the horses and haul more firewood down from the hills. The handsome spruce was left standing all alone in front of the house. The geese sheltered under its branches, but as the weather warmed, they would venture out and about, honking and squawking to each other. In late April, my mother noticed the geese were building a nest by the stream. Every morning she took me to see it. Several weeks later, 5 baby chicks hatched. That afternoon, my mother asked my father to visit the nest with us. There she told him that another child would be born when the snow came that winter. December of 1887 was mostly mild, with clear moonlit nights and sunny days. My folks stayed busy with their chores, all the while preparing for the new baby and caring for me. When he had a rare, spare moment, my father would sit by the stove and carve figures out of wood. Shortly before Christmas, he carved a small wooden nest, cradling 2 beautiful geese and their 5 babies. Later that evening, while my father was cleaning wood shavings from the blade of his old knife, my mother whispered, "I think it is time." My sister was born 2 days before my first birthday. On Christmas Eve, my father bundled me up and took me outside. We stood together at the base of the blue spruce tree. As he held me close, my father stooped down and gently placed the small nest he had carved in the low boughs of the tree. Then he said with a soft smile, "Happy Christmas, little one." So ends my grandfather's tale. More than 50 years have passed since he first told it to me. As a young man, I moved to the ranch I had loved as a boy. I married and raised my family here. Each Christmas Eve, for as long as I can recall, my father gathers in the shadow of the tree, which stands like a gentle giant beside our home. A breeze stirs the still night air. Twigs and needles sway as into the branches of the spruce I place the little wooden nest I first saw as a boy. For just a moment, I hear my grandfather's strong voice carried on the wind. He tells me not to forget what he taught me. Nice story.